is Digital Voices with Beau Tiffany. Inspiring and providing real insight to our listeners with every story. Exploring deep stories behind every guest. Please welcome your host, Beau Tiffany.
Hi guys, welcome back to another episode of Digital Voices. Today I'm delighted to have three special guests with us. We have retired attorney Robert Mills. We also have Phyllis Leavitt, a prominent psychologist, psychotherapist, and John Updike, the president of the Open Primaries. How is everybody today? Thank you for coming on.
Fabulous, Beau. Delighted to be with you, as always.
Great.
Yeah, doing well. Thanks for having us.
So, I've been excited. This really ties in well to what we've been doing lately with Robert and Phyllis. Robert, why don't I give you the floor and you can kind of break the ice for us on this, would you?
Well, one of the things that controls elections in America is how we structure the political process. It's really defining. And the way we handle primaries is, it traditionally has been the two parties hold a primary each. And the person who gets the most votes is kind of winner take all. They get nominated by that party. And that process, as you can obviously imagine, it nominates the person who's generally more extreme or more enthusiastic for the policies of that party, and leaves those who are not, or who are more moderate in their influences, sort of without a voice. And so we tend to have, with both parties, the more extreme elements running against each other in the general election, leaving a lot of people very unhappy on both parties, even because that's not the person they would have chosen. And so somebody came up with this much better way of doing it, and John's going to speak that. He's in charge of it. And it's an incredibly inspired thought, okay, which is that we throw it all together. We eliminate the political parties, the primaries of the parties, and we put everybody together and say, all the electorate, and say, who do you want to run for the general election? And you just take the top two vote getters. California adopted that. And along with that, we adopted another parallel reform, which was to let the independent experts select the districts for all the politicians. So you don't have districts that are real extreme one way or the other. And so those districts themselves become sort of a moderating influence because they're all competitive. And the result of all this is a dramatic transformation of California politics. We get things done now. It's much more moderate. People get along. The whole level of the intensity of the debate has become much more constructive. And Lois can speak, Phyllis can speak to the psychological implications of that, which are profound in how they affect how we relate to each other. But anyway, we're going to talk today with John and Phyllis and I about this incredible, insightful, and impactful way of reforming American politics by simply changing the way we select who ends up on the ballot.
Robert is right on the money. I think his description was very accurate, and I love to see your enthusiasm for this because, I started Open Primaries back in 2009. And back then, it wasn't even fringe. It was to the fringe of the fringe. The whole notion that changing the rules of the primaries would make any difference. I mean, I met with some people and they literally laughed at me. And here we are, 15 years later, and there's tremendous momentum. But to answer your question, the parties, Democrats and Republicans, have over the last generation or two, they actually have distorted what a primary is. The language that they've given to all of us is that the primary is the party's selection process. That's where the party determines which Democrat or which Republican will be on the ballot. It's actually not the history of primaries. When they were enacted 100 years ago, they were about they were part of the populist movement, the progressive movement, to give the people of the country more of a say in the kind of the backroom deal culture of the Gilded Age. But the parties have really gained control of the primaries. And what an open primary does is say these are no longer controlled by the parties. They're going to be controlled by the voters. So on primary day, as a voter, you could be a Democrat, a Republican, a Green, a Libertarian, peace and freedom, independent, no party, doesn't matter. Every voter is treated the same. And every candidate is treated the same. All the candidates are on one ballot. All the voters get the same ballot. You vote for, here's a radical concept, whoever you want. Okay? And then the most popular candidates in California and Washington and Nebraska, it's the two most popular candidates. They go to the November election. In Alaska, it's the four most popular candidates go to the general election, and they use ranked choice voting in the general election. And that's regardless of party. The parties now are what they should be, which is competitors. They don't control the process. They compete in the process. And that distinction is what open primaries really is all about. What open primaries is fundamentally is saying that the political parties have a right to exist. No one's talking about banning parties, but they need to be what they are, which is competitors, not umpires, not controlling the gates, not determining who can vote and who can't vote, not distorting the basic tenets of democracy to serve their partisan needs at the expense of the voters' needs. I hope I shared your enthusiasm there, Robert. I'm just trying to keep up with you.
May I respond just a little bit?
Yeah.
Excuse me. I have been fascinated for a long time about the hidden role of incentives everywhere in the economy and politics, everywhere. Adam Smith wrote this famous book, Wealth of Nations, and he talked about the unseen hand. And the unseen hand in politics sets prices, among other things. And poor Gorbachev came here back when he was visiting Reagan and said, the problem with the Soviet Union, we cause it the collapse. We don't know what things cost. We don't know what the prices really should be, because the economy and the capitalist sets that, and it makes everything efficient. In politics, there are all kinds of hidden incentives, and the important, and our political process has all kinds of incentives, and money and other distortions come in. But what the open primary does is harness some of these incentives. And one of the incentives is you want to win in the general election. And you don't want to have an incentive to just win in the primary. In the old system, which as John points out was not the original, it was the second.
Right.
It was all Republicans get together and run. Well, you're not going to be on the ballot unless you win that partisan primary. And to win that partisan primary, you have to be extreme enough to be the one who is the plurality of that party. And that automatically makes that person more extreme. And if you're looking to who's going to win in the general election, you have to look at the independents, which are now the largest political party in the United States by a significant margin. You have to try to get them. And so what that means is you aim for, and so this open primaries solves all this. And it picks the two people who are the most moderate and who are likely to be the ones. And so it makes politics, it makes whoever wins the general election much more moderate. And California adopted this open primary system, and it's worked incredibly well. And it's greatly moderated our politics out here. We used to have this fierce rivalry between the North and the South of California. I know people don't know that. I mean, LA and San Francisco were the two poles of this, and we couldn't stand each other. And now it's gone, because in large significant part by open primaries. We've changed all that, and the people get along together, and we get a lot more done here than we used to get done because of open primaries. So we've changed this hidden incentive there. We got other things to do, of course. John and I will talk about that, but this is the first big step.
Phyllis,
Yeah, let me just sort of jump in from a mental health point of view, because I don't know anything about open primaries, but it's a really good example of what I have been talking about bringing the principles of good psychotherapy, which is good mental health and good healing techniques for healing relationship, to the national stage, because we know in the microcosm of individual families and couples that domination and forced submission, whether it's through, the force of one's will or threats, or as you're talking about, parties becoming dominant through the way that the policies of elections are taking place, doesn't work to heal human relations or make healthy human relations. So it's really interesting to see that the idea of these open primaries actually allows for everyone's voice in a way that is part and parcel of good mental health. So yay. I just want to say yay. That's a beautiful example of what I'm talking about in my book and talking about on this podcast, and advocating in a very specific, applicable way to what's going on in our nation. So I'm thrilled to hear about this.
I have a great mental health story when it comes to open primaries. Can you indulge me for 2 minutes here?
Please.
Okay. So Nebraska has had open primaries since 1936. Only, however, for state legislative races. They have closed primaries for federal races. It's the only state in the country with kind of a two different system. But voters for generations have been used to this open system to elect their state senators. And I was talking with a colleague who's a Republican in Nebraska, and he was telling me a story about 15 years ago. There was no races in Nebraska that really excited him. So he decided to volunteer for a Republican candidate 5 miles from his house, but over the river in Iowa. So very close to where he lived, but it was in Iowa, which has a closed primary. And he said that 5-mile difference, that the Republicans in Iowa were completely different. He compared it to the Galapagos Islands. They're right next to each other, but culturally, psychologically, attitudinally, these Republicans in the closed system were very different than the Republicans in Nebraska. And he said, it dawned on me that growing up in Nebraska as a Republican, he's close to the Republican power brokers. This is not a progressive or liberal. He's a Republican, conservative. But he said, I can't tell you how I took for granted Democrats knocking on my door, getting phone calls from Democratic candidates, that I wasn't sequestered away from Democratic Party arguments and candidates and literature. I would choose to vote Republican. I rejected those ideas, but I valued the fact that in an open system, you hear different arguments and ideas. In Iowa, in a closed system, these Republicans, and this is my friend reporting to me, no Democrat had ever knocked on their door. They'd never gotten a phone call from a Democrat. They'd never gotten a piece of literature from a Democrat because they can't vote for Democrats. They don't have that choice. And so you put that in year after year, talk about the psychological impact of living in a silo. Do that for a generation, and you end up like the Galapagos Islands with the same species of person that looks completely different by virtue of what the system exposes them to.
Let me follow up on that. I think it's a brilliant insight. We are hardwired, excuse me, we're hardwired from evolution to respond, we humans, to what we perceive as threats, so things that make us fearful. And the internet, of course, has picked up the algorithms of the Facebook and all the posts, and politicians picked this going way back. They pitch to fear and anger because that's what makes people click and vote and donate. And so those influences have seeped into politics. And one way of trying to get them out of the politics is with this open primary system where you don't have a single issue candidate running. And so you look at politics now, you look at these people, Lauren Boebert, and the other extreme candidates that you see getting all this attention, Marjorie Taylor Greene, Why is somebody like that getting such huge media? Because the media likes that. This is a person that gets clicks, it gets people to listen to them. And, is the old saying in the media, if it bleeds, it leads, details at 11. The media loves to get this nasty stuff, the fights and everything. That's just what people want to watch, So we need to get that out of politics so we can get stuff done. And we can avoid the kind of cultural changes you're talking about, John, and the damage that Phyllis is talking about, that those cultural changes do, and these hermetically sealed environments where, and that's what I really worry about. One of the things that's hard to change, which is that there's this hermetically sealed environment in a lot of the conservative world where they have a sewage pipe down their throat, and they don't have any outside contact with reality, which knocking on a door like John is talking about, and actually having a face-to-face conversation with a Democrat, you would see they don't have horns. It doesn't smell like sulfur in their house, from the devil. I mean, it gives you a whole different outlook on this.
Well, let me jump in and just say that we are also hardwired to cooperate. So, that's the untapped resource that you're talking about tapping. Even if you don't vote a different way, the exposure is a cooperative one. I'm willing to listen. We can debate different points of view. That's an element of cooperation. And I think that that's something that really isn't being spoken to in the media. We're really being fed the competition and the domination principle, like you're going to only survive if you can conquer your enemy and beat them, rather than we're all really wired to cooperate to survive, or we wouldn't be here.
Right.
We wouldn't be here at all. And my experience as a psychotherapist has taught me over and over and over again that in our homes, in our families, in our relationships, we want the cooperation. We don't want the domination. That's what we're trying to heal, is domination that it over empowers one at the expense of the other. And so for me, the whole impulse to compete really needs to be within the container of a cooperative community, family, nation. So I just really want to emphasize that, because that is so missing from the political conversation, from the media. And what you're talking about, John, is a good example of starting to implement that.
And to follow up on what Phyllis just said, what this environment, this extreme environment produces, which is what it's producing now, is the notion that your political opponent is not just somebody with whom you disagree. It's a person who's wholly illegitimate, who's trying to destroy your way of life. You must defeat this person at all cost. And if people feel that way, which is what this media environment engenders, you can't have the cooperation impulse that's necessary, as Phyllis points out. And the open primaries creates this environment where, people listen to each other and the most moderate person wins, and you get stuff done, and there's a lot of things in politics that are hard to get done, and you need that help, but you get them done if you think that the person on the other side of the aisle is just someone with whom you have some disagreements, but you can sit down with them and cut deals, like we did in the 50s and 60s and 70s in the federal Congress of the United States. All kinds of great deals were made, and America made huge progress. We achieved much of our greatest achievements in those decades because people listened to each other in politics. We had a very different system than we do now, where it's so toxic that no one can even talk to each other.
Robert, something I want to challenge you on. Consider this a friendly challenge. Is I don't think it's the case that in an open primary the moderate always wins. I think all kinds of people get elected. Left-wingers, conservatives, libertarian people, moderate, all kinds of folks win. I think that the thing that is exceptional about an open system is that those candidates, regardless of their personal ideology or where they are on the spectrum, they're incentivized to work with people that they disagree with. And I think that doesn't make you a moderate. I got to know so many senators in Nebraska that are elected in this open system. Some of them are to the right of Attila the Hun. Some of them are democratic socialists. But they have this environment in which democratic socialists and arch conservatives can co-sponsor legislation to get rid of the death penalty.
Wow.
That doesn't make them moderates. And I think
let me clarify that. I agree with you, and I no system is going to like this is going to produce 100% people that you and I would call moderates. It's designed to pick the person that electorate selects.
Right.
And that electorate, we tend to blame other people sometimes than the people who go into the voting booths for the outcome because we don't like it. But I was listening to this fascinating historical interview with George Wallace. Remember him? And George Wallace ran as a liberal the first time he ran for governor.
Right.
And he was stomped by a conservative. He was defeated by a conservative. And so he said this was late in life when he was dictating his sort of his biography. He said when I started using I'm not going to use the N word, but he said when I started using the N word at my rallies, I'm talking about that. They stomped their feet and cheered and stomped the floor. And I started running on that, and that's what caused me to win. That led me to realize that we can't go too far in blaming a system, for the fact that there are voters out there and they make these decisions. And in that case, the voters were just out and out overtly racist. And so in those districts you're talking about, those people picked, the democracy worked. They picked the person that the majority in that district, and there wasn't, we would call them, more extreme, and they weren't moderates anyway, but they were the person who got the majority vote. So we can't expect the structure that we're talking about here to automatically guarantee, perfection, and that we're going to get wisdom out of all this. But what we do get is a more moderate outcome, generally speaking, and almost, than we would without it. And that's all we can do in a political structure. The rest of it's up to the voters, right?
Yeah.
Well, I tell you, to jump in, I'm loving this. I feel the magic in the air right now. I hope you guys are too. You mentioned the role of independents and unaffiliated voters in the primary politics. Can you explain how open primaries empower these groups and how moderate candidates within the major parties? That's right, moderate.
John, want to lead?
Yeah, I mean, independents are the largest and fastest growing segment of the electorate. And they face tremendous discrimination. We just did a report looking at the election laws of the 30 states that register voters by party. 20 states have nonpartisan voter registration. But in those 30 states, independent voters can't serve as poll workers in many of those states. They're ineligible to run for election judge. They can't be on the canvassing boards that count the votes or boards of elections. They can't be poll watchers. They can't vote in primary elections. There's a whole legal framework that discriminates against voters who say, you know what, I just don't want to be a member of a private political organization. I just don't, for whatever reason. So when you departisanize the primaries, what you're doing is you're allowing voters who don't want to join a political party to participate in every round of the election cycle. And let me just emphasize something. We're all taught that we live in a two-party system. Okay, that's almost like gospel in America. But it turns out when you actually do the numbers that 85% of us live in a one-party system. 85% of Americans live in districts where there's either a Republican Party and no Democratic Party, or Democratic Party and no Republican Party, or there is a party but it's so weak, like in Manhattan, there technically is a Republican Party, but they don't field that many candidates, and when they do, they get 5% of the vote. So your ability as an independent to vote in the primary, the first round, oftentimes is the only election. I mean, this will shock you. 50% of state legislators in the United States of America, not one state, not one little pocket, 50% of state legislators run unopposed in November. 50%. So if you can't vote in the primary, you literally have no choice. And of the other 50%, where there are more than one candidate on the ballot, 80% of that 50%, it's a landslide. Everyone knows who wins in advance, so you don't really have a say. Access to the primary is very important in terms of having any say at all in who represents you in the state capitol, in Congress, and so forth. Phyllis, where are you based?
I'm in Taos, New Mexico. Where are you?
Oh, great. I'm in Chicago, Illinois.
Okay.
We got this close to passing an open primaries bill in New Mexico this session.
I didn't even know it was up for election. How did that happen?
Well, we got a bill. We've introduced a bill to every session for the last 6 years, and they just get kicked out of committee. The Democratic Party really doesn't want it. But
Really?
Things have been changing. I mean, independents are now 50% of all new registrants in New Mexico.
Okay.
So
Great.
there's some pressure that's been building on the legislature, and they've finally decided to act. And we got this close to passing it. We got it through 3 committees, and then lost in this 4th committee. But we're confident we're going to get it done in the next couple of years.
Well, that relates to my question. I wanted to know how much you're working toward, or you or the people that you work with are working toward, really proliferating this idea and all of the wisdom behind it that you're sharing with us, because I never heard about any of this, and I don't know anybody who has, honestly. So I think it's magnificent, and I would love to see it really, really out there in conversation.
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly, the conversation has grown over the last decade, but you're right. It's not anywhere near talking about, Hunter Biden's laptop or Trump's latest shenanigans, or, that dominates. This is more a low-key conversation. That said, we've got legislative campaigns in Rhode Island, Pennsylvania, New Mexico. Ballot referendums are getting ready for 2024 in Idaho, in Nevada, in possibly Arizona, in Alaska. There is
To do what? To do what?
To do some form of open primaries,
Okay.
nonpartisan primaries, top 2, top 4, simply letting independents vote in party primaries as a first step. There's a lot of different policies that are being championed. It's not a one-trick pony, which I like. I like the fact that it's not all the same. So there is huge growth, but it's not yet completely in the mainstream. And also there's growing pains. We need more money. We need more activists. We need more, we're going up against the Democrats and Republicans. Name an issue where both parties are against you. That's the difficulty here. But, do a poll of Trump voters, do a poll of Biden voters. 70% of each group will say, yeah, we should allow all voters to vote in every taxpayer-funded election. I'm an American. I support democracy. It cuts across ideology. It cuts across partisan labels. The American people are with us. The political establishment is against us. And that's the challenge.
Well, it's also, if I can throw this in, it also relates to the mental health issues that I have been really espousing and trying to talk about in detail, because my basic model of my book, the one of the underlying keys of my book, is taking what happens in an abusive, neglectful family and looking through what happens in larger organizations and in the nation through that lens. So what are abuse and neglect dynamics in a family, and how are they being played out in a country, at the largest level of a family dynamic? And I call it the family of America because it is. And one of the things that happens in an abusive family is that you're not allowed to disagree. And you're also severely limited in the information that you can receive. So you have to toe the party line, or you are going to be open for further abuse or alienation. And so the kind of dynamics that you're talking about people who are so isolated and sealed off from any other information, is one of the tactics of an abuser to stay in power, that you can't get input from the outside. And so you only have one way of seeing the world, which is the person in power's way of seeing the world. So it's an exact correlation. And most people don't think this way. And that's one of the many reasons why I wrote this book, because these are the psychological dynamics that aren't healthy for anyone.
That's really powerful.
Um, John, in response to these fascinating points you raise, you talk about people didn't want to be part of a party. I'm reminded of Will Rogers' famous quote, "I'm not a member of any organized political party. I'm a Democrat." And Winston Churchill said, this whole notion of letting this guy everybody on the street decide how we run, who we have leaders and how we make, it's a ridiculous way of governing, to have democracy, until you compare it to the alternatives. And so I was thinking of that as you were talking, and a lot of what you were talking about just seems to be the inherent result of democracy. As I was talking about with the voters in Alabama, wanting a racist, and they were going to pick one, and then they weren't going to pick a moderate no matter what. And the more moderate person was, the more they hated him. So what other structural changes can we do to go into those basically one party systems? How do we crack that with what kind of devices and electoral incentives can we bring to bear that might penetrate that to some degree? And then I also want you to answer, I'd like to hear your thoughts on the parallel question, is that we have a lot of these places that are what I call information deserts. It's a right wing or a left wing in media environment where you don't hear you were talking about, you don't hear the other side at all. And so you don't even know what their arguments are. How do we penetrate both of those to bring some diversity to these environments?
Yeah, there's a whole set of things that would make a difference. Nonpartisan secretaries of state. I mean, why do we have partisans running our election system? Nonpartisan election administration, nonpartisan redistricting. Put the drawing of district lines in the hands of commissions, not politicians. There should be presidential debates that are not run by the parties. There should be a whole set of changes to the way we conduct our elections so the parties are not running it. There's some firewall between the parties and the people. And I think, and this goes back to something Phyllis just said about the dynamics in abusive homes and families. My particular focus is on structural changes that allow these independent voters to gain their footing, to gain their voice, to develop their identity, to develop their power. Because I'm sure you've come across this, Phyllis. Once you break free of an abusive environment,
right,
it's not like you're a fully formed, now functional, there is a certain trauma or a certain, you're an independent. It's the largest group of voters in the country. Every newspaper in America says you're not really an independent. You're a leaner. You're still a Democrat. You're just a Democrat light or a Republican light. They negate that independence, which in my mind, it's almost kind of like, hey, you've left that abusive relationship, but you're still in it. You can't get away from it.
Yeah. And I think that's a really powerful point, the way you described it, of when you leave an abusive family,
Yeah.
different person. But you are also still forming. But what I would say is what it takes to leave an abusive family is finding some center in yourself that's stronger than the abusive influence.
Right.
And that in itself will automatically create different choices. Is there a lot of learning and growing and maturing to do once you've left a system that has, dominated your life? Yes. But there's a core sense of self, usually, I would say, that allows for a different set of choices, attractions, and an open-mindedness, because I just don't see it happen ever that when someone heals, to whatever extent they heal, to be able to leave an abusive system or an abusive relationship, that they're looking for violence, that they're looking for more hatred, that they're looking for how to alienate other people. I just don't see it.
Right.
John, on following up on a couple of your points there, about, first of all, about the nonpartisan redistricting. We initiated that. We passed that in California.
Yep.
We did nonpartisan, and it made an enormous difference. People didn't realize how much difference it would make. And what they did is they had independent judges and other people that were nonpartisans divide up the districts, and so you didn't have red districts and blue districts, which
Right.
tend to have the extreme. You had mixed. Every district was competitive,
Right.
and that moderated all by itself, all on its own. Okay, and the other thing is. You talked about the independents being called leaners, right? And they're all say whether they lean Democrat and lean Republican. Yes, but those leaners call the shots, because that's what his last 4 or 5 presidential elections, those people have called the shots. And if you look at where those, they actually decided who was going to be the president. So the people on both parties, they have to look to those leaners and they have to pitch and they have to convince them. So they have this enormously exaggerated power now, because both parties are courting them because they call the shots. And so this system is empowering them, which is what we want it to do, because they're the most moderate forces.
Part of the challenge is that you're so right. The two major parties are courting them, but they're also not courting them. And here's what I mean by that. They find ways to communicate with independents, but not to acknowledge that they're independents. They want their votes, but they want to bring them back into the partisan game that they're playing. And they refuse to relate to them as independents. Now, why is that important? Because I think democracy is more than just who you vote for. I really do. I think it's the other 364 days a year. It's the cultural aspects. It's the, if you look at the labor movement 100 years ago, they were not fighting for better pay, for better working conditions, for this and that. They were fighting for the right to simply organize, that was a legitimate thing to do, which is to build unions. Once they won the right to be legitimate, they could fight for better wages and better conditions and all that. Independents are still illegitimate, even though, as you're saying, Robert, we decide all the elections. We decide everything. But yet they still relate like we're not a real force in America. It's maddening. I find it maddening.
What can be done about it?
Well, I think that the structural reforms like open primaries contribute to a emerging independent power. That's one component. I think we need to challenge political science and punditry that still use outdated terms for independence and use these lazy poll. They ask you, how do you lean? They don't ask Democrats and Republicans how they lean. I think we need to work with academics and opinion makers. And this is happening. This is not just fantasy. You're starting to see some top journalists and academics say, wait a minute, maybe we have independence all wrong. And that's very positive. I think we need to, this is why I picked a fight with you about the word moderate. Because I actually think moderate, though it's a good term, is still an ideological term, and it connotes people that are in between left and right. And the thing about independence is there is no ideological cohesion. And I think we have to find ways to break down the very language that we use to describe independence and all Americans, because actually ideological language holds back the emergence of an independent movement. That's just my opinion. Because I think ideological language is outdated. It's outmoded. It doesn't accurately describe the mess and the complications and the difficulties of American politics right now. I mean, is Trump a conservative?
Definitely not. Not historically or ideologically, or and you could, that's what the conservatives say. It's a whole different phenomenon. But I agree with you on this stuff. I think that a lot of terms in politics and have lost their meaning or have limited meaning, or just in the case of moderate, it's just a bucket that we throw all these people in, and
right.
And just for simplicity and for clarity, we call it something, we call it moderates, but it's a whole collection of people, range all over the place. And, and they're just trying to figure out, if I don't throw my vote away by not voting or voting for some third party that's going to lose, I got two choices. Okay. And that's it really. And if, which one do I want to see? I may not like them. And most of them don't. And a lot of people on both parties don't like the choices, okay? But they recognize that there are only two choices. And if they don't pick one of them, they're not going to be they're going to be stuck with the consequences of the choice that others make. And so they go and they make one. And alas, I think in some ways that is an inherent feature of democracy itself, is you don't get to call the shots, and we have to go along. It's the majority rule. And so we have to be, all the guy on the street and all these people, they're calling the shots. The majority of them pick the leaders. And so, I agree with you that we have this bucket that we put everything in, and how we can structure this so that we empower them better and give them more say and distinguish this. It is a great art form that you're doing great work for democracy. And I salute that, in trying to advance that. It's very important work you're doing. And it ain't easy. And that may be one of the great conundrums that you have to solve.
Yeah, it is.
I do have a question for you guys, though. Moving towards campaign contributions, which is the role of money, how does the open primaries affect these aspects? And do the primaries make it harder or easier for special interests to influence candidates?
I think it makes it clearly easier, because the margins are smaller, and you don't have these organizations. So I mean, actually, campaign contributions corrupt the system, no matter what kind of system you use. I mean, they're basically bribes, and we call them campaign contribution in our culture, but they are bribes in every sense of the word. There are quid pro quo, some special interest or somebody with a particular ideological bent wants to pick people who agree with them, and under our system they get to do that. That is a bribe by any stretch of the imagination. And it has long been recognized that this whole influence of people putting money in the campaigns is incredibly corrupting of the whole process, and creates this hugely disproportionate megaphone for special interest groups and people with money. And it was an ambition of the political establishment for decades to keep them from limiting that. And Citizens United, which was the Supreme Court case that outlawed campaign restrictions and permits through the use of these political action committees and use of nonprofits and so forth to hide the identity. Foreign countries come in now and secretly contribute to our campaigns. And this is a shame. It's a horrible abuse. It severely damages democracy. And one of the first things that we need to do, John, come the revolution, is to change that. And it's going to take a change in the Supreme Court to do it. But its impact, I mean, it was a bipartisan majority in Congress that recognized they were sick to death of having to, to spend all their time chasing money. And so they passed this thing, which the Supreme Court struck down. And that's got to be one of the fundamental objectives of everybody who wants reform in America, who wants to see our politics become healthy, is you have to get money out of it that way and go back to the old ways of getting votes instead.
John?
Yeah, I mean, I think a very good friend of mine, Jeff Clements, has started an effort called American Promise, which is working to change the U.S. Constitution to deal with Citizens United. And I was just talking with him a couple of weeks ago, and he said one of the things that has made this issue even more troubling is the emergence of AI and the ability of these kind of deep fakes and artificial intelligence, and, as you're saying, Robert, foreign money, outside the country money. It's not just the kind of the moral corruption of the kind of the bags of cash under the table from the mobsters to the politicians, or from the, whatever, which not good, but this is a whole new level. And what the Supreme Court has said is that the American people don't have a right to regulate politics. And I think that's wrong. And I'm really hoping Jeff is successful at that. At the same time, I really believe there are limitations to the regulatory approach to politics. I don't mean to say this to be cynical. I support these efforts to regulate money in politics. But I always say to people, rich, influential people will always find a way. That's not an argument against regulation. It's an argument of saying, create your regulations, enforce those regulations, but don't then get complacent. Equally important, if not more important than regulating the powerful, is empowering the disempowered, is creating a voice for ordinary Americans. And I've always been in fights with campaign finance reformers that say, if all we do is pass McCain-Feingold or whatever we're doing, then everything else is fine. And I'm like, I just don't believe it. I wish we lived in a simple world like that. So I support these efforts. I support American Promise. I support all of them. And I focus my time on creating a voice for the voiceless as opposed to regulating the powerful.
Go ahead, Phyllis.
Well, I was going to say, and I think that's what I'm doing in a different way in my book, which is educating people. People really don't know. I mean, all the things that you're talking about, John, I don't think are common conversation unless I'm really out of the loop. But, I think educating people about what is the fallout from the dynamics we have? What does it mean when we have the domination of a two-party system? And one of the things I can say from the psychological mental health point of view that is, sort of patently obvious from that point of view is that people who live in a world of black and white thinking, which is what the two-party system extremes advocate, or demonstrate, are not psychologically mature. The world isn't black and white. It isn't just one party's right and one party's wrong, or one people are good and one people are bad. We're multifaceted. We're complex human beings. There are many, many, many points of view that need to be heard. And what you're talking about in working with just opening up the primaries is one step toward having those voices be heard in a different way. And I totally agree, the voice for the voiceless, which is many, many people in this country.
Can I ask a question to follow up on that real quick?
Sorry.
So do open primaries make it harder or easier to sway a candidate on specific issues during the primary season or after?
What was the verb? Do open primaries make it what, a candidate?
Does it make it harder or easier to sway candidates on specific issues during the primary season or after the primary season's over?
To sway them.
So we're talking about how money comes into play, the role of
Sure.
money, that sways public opinion oftentimes. I'm just wondering if, looking at open primaries, circling this back around, does that make it harder to influence candidates? Is it make it hard to, or does it make it more difficult for the role of money to influence the politics? And, I guess I'm just looking for that.
I would say, yes, it does make it harder for money because the voters have this list of candidates they get to pick from. And it is in contrast to the traditional way with, they all compete together to get the nomination. Right now, that there they are all on the ballot. And so it's harder to influence them. And each of them knows that in order to win, they're not after this initial objective, which screens it all out in the beginning with the regular political system, that you got to get nominated or you're lost. Okay, they don't have to worry about that. They have to worry only about what happens in November in the general election. And they know if they start taking a much of special interest money that they may lose, and so they're trying to get it. It's the voters that matter and the positions they take that basically get the widest range of votes. That's why the whole thing works. And back to some of John's points about these structural things, I agree that it's not perfect, okay, and nothing that we come up with right now is perfect because of the reason I brought up earlier, which is that it's a democracy, okay, and that means that all those people get to vote, and we don't think a lot of majority thinks in some districts is all that wise, but that's what democracy is, and so we can't expect our political structure to always universally produce wisdom if there's not wisdom in the electorate. However, and this is really important, the open primary is a huge step of freeing up our political structure to produce more moderation and common sense and give the average voter more real say-so in the outcome. It makes a huge step in that direction, one of which we've seen in California and other states, and it's not perfect, and we still got work to do, and it's going to be difficult. We talked about amending the Constitution to eliminate that Supreme Court case. That's, with all due respect, that's a fantasy, and it's a waste of time. You cannot amend the Constitution now for anything, really, because of the political, it takes 3/4 of the states. Good luck, right? I mean, you couldn't get motherhood through or apple pie. So, one Yale professor came up with a fascinating way of solving this, which I'll throw out. He said that next time the Democrats get control all three of the Senate and the House and the White House, which they did recently, what you do is you go to the District of Columbia and you divide it into 155 independent states, which you can do. And you give each one of them a couple senators and Congress, and they block by block, they're states. And you can do this under the Constitution. And then you call a constitutional convention. And you've already got the majority to call the Constitutional Convention. And you go back and you fix all this stuff. You fix Citizens United, you fix the Second Amendment, you fix a whole bunch of other things that are broken, you clean up a bunch of stuff. And one of the things that you can clean up, which is driving a lot of our politics, people don't really, maybe from other states don't appreciate, but 8 states have the majority of people in the United States. And they set this whole thing up with this compromise called the Connecticut Compromise. People don't remember the Connecticut Compromise. It screwed up everything. James Madison was going to have the states have proportional representation in the Senate. And these guys showed up, and he's a Virginian, and these guys, the other people showed up from Virginia, said, no. We want the slaves to count for apportionment in the House. And the North said, wait a minute, there's already 200,000 slaves in Virginia. They're handcuffing them and putting them in chains and kidnapping them back here as fast as they can get them. Pretty soon there's going to be more slaves in the South, and there are voters in the North. We're not going to go along with that. And so it all but derailed the Constitutional Convention in 1787. And they were trying, what are we going to do? And Delaware, which is the smallest state, went to the people in Connecticut and they said, I think these people are stupid enough to let us have equal representation in the Senate, we give them something on this racial thing, because they were told not to come back home unless they had achieved this counting of slaves. So I'll tell you what, let's do. Let's give them 3/5 of a vote for apportionment, and we'll give them the characterizing slaves as property, which they want, which is completely inconsistent, but let's go along with that. And let them, in exchange for that, let's have all the states be equal and get 2 senators. And so, Delaware with 90,000 people can have 2 senators, same as Virginia has 500,000 whites and 200,000 slaves. It'd be the same. And so they went along with it. And so right from the get-go, the states were out of whack. And it got worse and worse and worse and worse. And now you have 8 states with half the population. They get 16 senators, and the others get 86. And California, with nearly 40 million people, has 2 senators, and Wyoming with 500,000 has 2 senators. So that your vote in Wyoming counts 79 times more in the United States Senate than a Californian's vote. And this is throwing everything off. And it didn't matter when the states were kind of, there wasn't this division now between Democrats and Republicans on the same demographics that it was. You had, this famous senator from Arkansas, what was his name? I forget. And you had a lot of famous liberals from the South and from these other states. And it didn't matter really in the politics of the country that this disproportionate thing was going on. It does now because for the first time, the parties are dividing by education and income. And the wealthy, educated states are voting Democrat, and wealthy-educated cities are voting Democrat, and the rural, less educated people are voting Republican for the first time. Even the working people are moving to the Republican side, and the educated suburban wives who were once Republicans are moving to Democrats. And we're having this resorting of the parties in a way that makes this really important, because rural, less educated America has a enormously disproportionate thing. Look at the Electoral College. California should have 300 electoral votes, and Wyoming should have a third. And look what. So you have this huge distortion based on these things, which is ever growing and ever worse. And that is what's is something for reform, but it's going to take some gimmick, like I just talked about. That professor from Yale came up with subdividing District of Columbia to 155 states. He wasn't kidding. It could be done, and it would solve all these problems, because they're constitutional problems. And that's one way of solving it. Going through the normal process and expecting them to overturn Citizens United is, that's folly. But this is one way of doing it. It would take something like that. That would change everything.
It's a shortcut, though.
It's the only cut that would ever work. I mean, you structure a system in which the bad guys control the vote. Okay, you're not going to get them to relinquish that. It never happened in history. Never happened in the future. And right now they control. And they're not giving it up. I mean, historically, the only time we ever amended the Constitution, when it was some very, very deeply bipartisan thing, you're never going to do it on a partisan issue, never. And so if you want to reform and save American democracy, which is grossly distorted right now, and, you had, Biden almost lost the election. He won by 9 million votes, and he almost lost. And you shift a couple 100,000 votes around, you would have lost. And how can we? Trump lost by 2 million votes, and he won, and that's not the way it's supposed to work, And it's the case across the board, and it's getting ever more out of sorts, and worse and worse. And the cities and the states, are shifting population, and it's going to get further out of sorts. And this is one way of solving it, and it may be our last chance to solve it.
John, what do you think?
I don't want to pick a fight.
Pick a fight. Come on, that's what we're here for.
No, I find it objectionable what you're saying. By your logic, a military coup that goes to DC and overthrows the government in the name of saving the country would be justified. And I just disagree completely. I think those kind of tricks of, hey, let's turn DC into 150 states, that's the same thing as this crazy theory that got overturned in the Supreme Court. People on both sides of the aisle are looking to game the system to gain support for their side. I don't support it. I disagree with it. I'm against it.
John, I agree with what you just said. It is a gimmick and it is highly objectionable. But if Trump gets reelected in 24, that's it.
No, it's
if a Trump, it is.
Well, then you don't think that's really of the American people. I don't know what to say about that. I look, I'm old enough to know anybody but Bush. If George Bush gets reelected, the whole country will destroy itself. If Reagan gets elected, the whole country will die. You know, it's scare tactics. I don't know. I don't like Trump. Trust me. I don't like Trump. I like people that voted for Trump. I have no problem with them. I really don't. I understand their motivations completely, even if I think this guy is a criminal and a con artist. I just think the American people are strong and their belief in democracy and fair play are very, very strong. And I object to people who say, if this one election goes a way that I don't like it, America's over. Oh, okay.
Well, I hear.
I'm just tired of those things. I'm tired of people saying that.
I worked on those campaigns, that with Reagan and with Bush, and I met George Bush in the Oval Office and had a long conversation with him, and I liked him. If you met him personally, you'd like him. I voted against him, but I never believed. I think it was just hyperbole to say that and the same with Reagan. These guys were Reagan was deep. Both of them were deeply respectful of the American institutions. They cared about the other side. Reagan was deeply honorably, friendly, in private, and he restrained himself. He threw out the right wingers. I mean, he used to have this gimmick in all his campaigns. He'd say, the problem with the Republican Party, he would say, is you have your right wing, and then he would look over to the left at this sight gag, and he'd come back, and you have your extreme right wing. And he restrained the extreme right wing. And George W. Bush was a very honorable. He was. I don't agree with him, and was within the bounds of politics. I didn't agree with him at all, but I respected him in that sense, and I think that there was that element there. I think there's something fundamentally different that's going on today throughout the United States, where you're having this madness is sweeping through the Republican Party, and it's scary, and it's a complete rejection of all the political norms that we have all held dear all this time. And Trump is openly saying that he's going to appoint a real prosecutor. He's going to throw aside he's basically saying, you elect me, I'm going to have a coup, and I'm not going to go along with this stuff. And these other things were nothing even in that ballpark. What we're facing now in America is a fundamental challenge to the very idea of democracy. And you see it in the language that's used in the Republican Party. The Democrats are not legitimate. They threaten the American system, and if you let them, if you elect them, you're destroying our way of life. They really believe that, and so I think there is a gimmick, and it would be it would be something you have to think twice about doing. I think you can make an argument within the political sphere with some people saying this would bring us to nirvana, and back into the days when you had Fulbright. It was a senator from Arkansas, and you had all these other famous liberals from Gore from Tennessee, Lyndon Johnson from Texas. And you had all these liberals from these conservative states now, and you had this bipartisan structure. It could get us back to that, and where the democracy would be a democracy, and you couldn't win the presidency without winning the popular vote. And this would empower every voter in America, not the ones in these small states. And they get, in the Electoral College, you get a vote for each senator, and you get so it throws the whole thing off enormously. And it's 250 years old. It needs to be redone. And you're going to end up with electing a president who loses by 15 million votes. And is that going to produce a revolution? Is that going to produce some horrible outcome? It might. It might produce a revolution, or at least violence or a civil war or other outcomes that are no worse than the outcome of getting together and doing it with this gimmick I talked about, which I acknowledge is a gimmick and would probably never happen because people would not be comfortable doing it. But if they did do it, it would bring us back to the vision of America that James Madison had and the founding fathers had, in which each person would count one and each state would have some equality in the Senate. There's no reason to give California 2 senators. That's crazy. And it produces this distortion that is behind a lot of really ugly stuff and bad politics. And it's playing us, weakening the United States. We are weakening in all kinds of ways. Look at the education of our children, the environment.
Hey, Robert, why are you not letting anyone else speak? Why are you just ranting? I don't know.
Go ahead. Take it.
I'm not sure what's going on with you.
Let's get Phyllis in.
We're having a conversation, and then you just go off on a rant. I don't know what is going on here.
Jump in.
You want to keep ranting? Because I'll just go have lunch and come back.
Well, I invite you to interrupt and set your point out. I want to hear it.
I already said what I'm saying. I find gimmicks objectionable. They're un-American. I don't like them. That's my point.
Yeah, I'll jump in.
Bring us back together.
Well, from a different angle, I'll jump in. And that is that, my whole argument, and I understand that there are many approaches to healing what's going on in America, and I don't pretend to speak for all of them. My training is in psychology. I've worked with hundreds of people over the years. I've done enormous work in my own life, and it's an ongoing process. And the bottom line for me is the quality of our human relations. And one of the things that I think is really hard for people to embody is that you can't fight dysfunction with, you can't fight it. That's actually taking on dysfunction to try to overcome dysfunction. There has to be a whole other way of relating to one another that is not win-lose, that is not domination and suppression, even if it's in an argument. That there has to be a way to come to the table, and that the goal is coming back together. We don't have to agree. Like you were talking about, John, people don't necessarily agree, but they're willing to talk. And they may vote differently in the end, and they may have very different values, but they come together and talk. And there's sort of guidelines of how we do that. There's a commitment to listening. There's a commitment to taking responsibility for your own part in whatever's going on. There's a commitment to try to repair as well as possible, which may be apologizing, which may be, making amends in some other way. There's a commitment to making agreements, even if you don't get all of what you want. And the ultimate commitment is to form some kind of reconnection with one another, whatever that is. So just to go to the argument, which, I don't really have any stand on the DC argument, but the psychological point of view, or the mental, really, I want to say mental health point of view, is that we implement the ways of relating to one another that have the integrity that we want to have as human beings. And I think that's the hardest work for human beings to do. And I think our politics are a long way from that. But I know that that's what we all want in our own lives. We want people who relate to us with integrity, even if they don't agree. So, yeah, I think it's a hard road, and I think it's a steep road to keep advocating for what is psychologically and mentally healthy in the ways that we try to work out our conflicts. So, I feel like that's sort of a broad stroke, but I think it speaks to what you're talking about. Like, like a gimmick isn't gonna heal the country. In fact, it's not, in my view, and just like a gimmick is not going to heal a relationship.
Well, let me speak to that. I take your point, and I respect it. But I would argue to you this is not a gimmick. Okay, it's legal and it's constitutional, and it empowers the voters of the United States equally. It gives them the voice they do not currently have, and if they don't like it, they can change it. And the problem is now the system we have is grossly dysfunctional, and it's disempowering and disenfranchising tens of millions of people. And it's driving us ever into more dysfunctional politics, of which there's no way out. And, what is the alternative to the so-called gimmick? Okay, a constitutional amendment, never going to happen, never going to happen. And it's impractical. And so it's not a choice. It's not an option. So what is the option? Here is a way of empowering people.
So let me say, like, what if we, four of us here right now, were embodying the kind of listening, and, we don't have to agree. What if we just embody that respect of one another and the deep listening and really speaking our truth and letting ourselves be heard? And let the listeners to this program decide what they think about whatever we're talking about. But I don't think we have to argue. I think we have different points of view, and let them all be heard. And, let's be the role model for what it is we want to create here. And in that vein, I'd love to hear what you think, Beau.
Well, I think you hit it on the head. We're talking about things that all of us are passionate about, and we come from our own perspective and backgrounds. But when we come together, because we're so passionate about these subjects and opinions, it's difficult sometimes for us to be open to express as well as to receive. And even when we have intellectuals like we have sitting in this podcast today, we still have a little bit of that, which just shows the larger issue, which is, how do we communicate in a way that's productive and is getting past some of the barriers or the fences that we have up for our personal perspectives or boundaries, just to be open to hear what somebody else has to say. And I do like what Phyllis said is about, letting listeners come up with their own opinions. That's what this is about. We're bringing, the facts and the players and as much information to the table as we can. And people that are turning into this are interested in the topic, but they're also then listening to us, and with their own backgrounds and opinions are, leaning towards one of us more than the other just because of that fact. But at the same time, making sure that, constructive arguments versus disagreements. So, yeah.
Well, let me defend myself here a little bit. I think that this podcast has been very productive. And I think John has served us well here by articulating very well his point of view. And it's an important point of view, and I respect that point of view. And disagreement is inherent. It's inherent in politics. It's inherent in life, and it's how we handle it. And I think we've handled it respectfully. And I don't agree with calling things arguments in a pejorative sense. I mean, that's what a collection of ideas that disagree with is called an argument. Lawyers use that, and courts use it. And they use it in a very respected way. I mean, they say this argument is this and there's that argument. And it's a persuasive accumulation of ideas and facts to sort of support a particular conclusion. And it's a noble thing. And I think we've all been trying to do that here in our own way. And I think John has done a very good idea. And to our listeners, we have articulated in a way that people can hear, two different points of view on this. And I think that's very helpful to people, and they can reach their own conclusions about it.
I agree.
Yeah,
John?
I certainly apologize, Robert, if I felt frustrated and I kind of acted out in the moment. I apologize for that. I think I'm a big fan of argument. I'm a big fan of putting out disagreements and letting them be part of the discussion. And again, I'm not defending myself. I think I've kind of lost my cool a little bit. I was having difficulties not with what you were saying, but how you were saying it. it felt like there was just a shift in our discussion that I wasn't particularly comfortable with. But that's just me. That's my limitations, and I apologize for that. I shouldn't have snapped at you like that. That was uncalled for, and I apologize.
Thank you for saying that. It's very big of you. And you know, I welcome. You know, I'm a lawyer, so I have enormous respect for the other side. You know, you develop that through a career, that the other side has got a client, the other side is legitimate, and you have to pay respect that. And so, you know, with me, just so you know, if you disagree with me, jump in and say, Robert, hold on there. You know, what about this and what about that? And I want to make this point. I want to make that point. And that's what you and I have been doing on this podcast. And I think it's very helpful. And that's why courts, you know, I mean, you learn early on as a lawyer that there's two sides to everything. And you can't decide the issue until you've heard both sides. And so that's what we're here for. And I think you've been doing a great job of carrying your side of it, you know, which is a powerful and important issue for people to hear.
Robert, before we close this or come to a conclusion on this, I did have one question that I thought you'd be probably great to answer. You had mentioned jungle primaries early in our podcast. There's probably listeners that are unfamiliar with that term. So I'm wondering if you or John could tear that apart a little bit and tell us what that is and how that differs from regular primaries.
John, that's your bailiwick.
Yeah, the jungle primary is just a pejorative for the top two. It's used by opponents of the open primary to try to give it a negative connotation, but it's just a slur. It's not a formal system. You know, it'd be like calling it the chaotic primary or something like that. It's just meant to get people to think negatively about it.
Understood.
But look, there's lots of positivity about the jungle, lots of biodiversity, lots of, you know, different species being together. So I never took it as a slur. I'm like, wow, they gave us the jungle for what they don't like, but I like the jungle. So, you know.
That's what they call it. It's called the jungle primary. And it is extremely effective. It does what everybody wanted it to do,
Yep.
which is to give voice to everyone and reduce this contentious, you know, extremists on each side and produce two relatively moderate candidates who could. And then what happened, the ultimate result of all this is it put people in the legislature who can go out and have lunch with each other and make things happen. And California has had this enormous increase in productivity of legislation and moderation of it, and less anger. And you know, Phyllis would think we were much mentally healthier here as a result of all this, and it works.
Well, in the old system, there was this famous story of two Democrats and two Republicans formed a little secret caucus under the old partisan system to try to see if they could get some kind of bipartisan legislation going. And they had to meet at a diner outside of Sacramento at like 1 a.m. And even then they got discovered. And when they got discovered, they basically like lost their committee assignments, lost their offices, lost their staff. They were like exiled just for the temerity of having coffee with someone from the other party. And now fast forward to the new system, Democrats and Republicans, there was actually a race in the northern Central Valley where a Democrat running for assembly and a Republican running for state senate campaigned together. They're like, look, different parties, but we represent the same area. We both believe in a lot of the same things. We want to represent this district. We don't agree on everything, but we both think we're good people. Vote for both of us. Like, what other place could a Democrat and a Republican campaign together? So, you know, I think that's much mentally more healthy for voters to see that up front.
Absolutely. Well, let's close this up. Let's do some closing statements or remarks. Is there anything that we haven't addressed that would be good to throw into this cast? I think we hit most of our outline pretty well.
Yeah, I mean, really just have a question for the three of you. Does it feel like throwing in the mental health perspective adds to the conversation for you?
Absolutely.
Absolutely. You know, I remember the days that John is aware of, that, you know, in California, where the two parties couldn't meet together, and there was just all this shrill rhetoric and this stuff back and forth between the northern part of the state and the southern part of the state. And back in the day, that's where Reagan got his start and Nixon got his start, and the John Birch Society, all these far right groups in the South. And there was this bitterness, and it was genuine bitterness between the North and the South. And a lot of psychological stuff was associated with that, Phyllis. There was bitterness and there was anger, and they couldn't get and Southern California suffered. They could not get legislation done. They couldn't work together. And when this change came through, people could sit down, like John was just saying, they campaigned together. I mean, they could sit down together, like in the old days, and get stuff done. And California won because of that. Every citizen won.
Yeah, there's no doubt in my mind that bringing what serves mental health and greater relatedness and agreement and peacefulness and inclusion between people is not an exact replica of what we need in our country, because it's just, our country is citizens, it's individual people. So what's good for us is good for our country, and what's not good for us is not good for our country.
I think, something that comes to mind, Phyllis, and I'd love to read your book when it's published, is that part of what I find helpful about it is that you're not talking about individuated psychology. You're talking about group dynamics. You're talking about domination. You're talking about dysfunctional environments for collections of people, be it communities or families. And I think that, is very helpful, because my understanding of that is that you're not looking to just point out that people are victims. You're looking to empower people to change these dynamics.
100%.
And I think I think about that in my work all the time, that it's easy to just get on a soapbox and point out what's wrong.
Right.
But that can actually be, it can actually contribute to cynicism in certain contexts, not all contexts, but in some contexts. The more challenging thing is, how do you point out what's wrong and then mobilize and inspire people to be part of creating a new culture in response to that? And
Right.
That's what I like about your bringing this to the discussion.
Thank you, because that is really the point, and sort of the slant of my book, is that you point out what's not working, not for the sake of blame, not for the sake of shame, not for the sake of attack, but like a doctor will say, this is what's wrong with your leg, so that we know what to do to heal it. It's the diagnosis is just part of the cure.
Mm-hmm.
And they go together. And if they don't go together, it does bring cynicism. And if they do go together, then there's hope. Oh, we know what's happening here on a dynamic level that really doesn't work. What are the dynamics that do?
I think the benefit of this, the proposal of the unified primary, the jungle primary, the open primary, is that it creates a political structure that has its own incentives, a political structure that inherently, left to its own devices, inherently favors the most moderate, reasonable people, and therefore heals the political process, and produces a more functional democracy all by itself. You don't have to persuade people, which is the hard way. I mean, it just works all by itself. And I think that these hidden incentives like that are underappreciated in how important they are in making our system work.
Mm-hmm.
So I want to thank you, John, for just bringing your whole point of view. I really learned a lot, and I feel like it sparked a really important conversation. So thank you so much. And thank you for the work you're doing.
Well,
Yeah,
thanks.
I agree. And I think that the work you're doing is it cannot be overstated how important it is. And we wish you every success in it.
Same to you both as well. This has been a great conversation, warts and all.
Let me take one moment though. John, we haven't touched base in a couple of years. What's going on with you currently that we can help promote for you with awareness?
Yeah, we just launched a campaign in Florida called Florida Open Primaries, flopenprimaries.org, to close the write-in loophole. This is Florida has an open primary if all the candidates are from the same party, which happens quite frequently. But politicians from both parties use phony write-in candidates to close the primary, and we're trying to close that loophole. We just launched that campaign last night. We have a really important legislative effort going on in Pennsylvania. Our spokesperson there is Steelers great Rocky Bleier. We just had our first hearing in Harrisburg, and we've gotten the endorsement of 21 newspapers. So if you're in Pennsylvania, go check out ballotpa.org. We've got petitioning going on in South Dakota and Idaho. Campaigns are about to kick off in Arizona and Nevada. There's a big defense campaign in Alaska this year. There's an effort to close the primaries up in Alaska, and we're going to have to defend that. And then there's us, Open Primaries. Just go to our website, openprimaries.org, get connected. We'll connect you to whatever's going on in your state, because there's a lot of early stage exploration and incubation going on all over the country.
Excellent. Well, lady and gentlemen, thank you so much for coming on today. I think this is a great discussion. I really enjoyed it. And I think we definitely hit some nerves that all of us are passionate about. And I think that came out pretty well in this conversation. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
This has been Digital Voices with Beau Tiffany, exploring deep stories from real-life guests with real-life experiences, providing insight to our listeners with every story. Stay up to date on future podcasts by bookmarking Digital Voices with Beau Tiffany.podbean.com and follow Beau on social media by searching Digital Voices with Beau Tiffany. Have an idea for a future story? Send your idea to acrmadison@gmail.com. Until next time, grab life by the horns and keep inspiring others.